welcome to Coyote Chat, y'all. This is our 10th installment of Coyote Chat. For today, we have a very special guest for students. Probably needs no introduction, but for everyone else in attendance today, we have Professor Matt Jones. He's a professor of political science here at Saragossa, and he has a very exciting presentation for you all today. Jones.
All right. So yes, today's 9/11, and that's I do this actually every year in my classes, but some people have seen this before, but it's going to be a little bit different because they bet me that I would cry, and that's just not going to happen because I'm going to win the bet. So, but I do this every year in part because I need to. I truly do, and this time I decided to kind of exploit student government to be able to do this here instead of in my classes, since I'm always behind in my classes anyways. So the real thing here, however, is the reason why I do this is because I was in Boston. I was in Boston as a lobbyist on September 11th, and we were meeting with the governor of Massachusetts that day, and so being in what I've realized since then is that there's kind of a blast radius for September 11th. And when I used to ask my students, where were you on September 11th? And then I just kind of stopped doing that because they kept saying not born, and it made me feel really old. But the other thing is that people who were born, frequently they're on the West Coast, and it just doesn't have the same blast radius as being on the East Coast. And it doesn't have the same blast radius as kind of having this impact on people in your life in the same way, and your own life. And so what I decided to do is, because I was a student of history and I teach history and I lived it, I decided that I could combine those two things. That really what we have is history happens at kind of two levels. It happens at the level of kind of story, big, grand story, kind of as Shakespeare says, all the world's a stage and we are merely players. And we can kind of see history as the story, and Hollywood kind of turns it into a story, including 9/11, Nicolas Cage, firefighter, the whole thing, so Flight 93. And we can kind of start to disconnect the fact that history isn't just the story of things that happen and heroes and villains and victims, but it's about real people who actually had to experience death. History happens to real people. And I want to start this with this, because I want us to understand. I'm going to start with the history, and we're going to kind of get this rough explanation. It's a rough explanation of why 9/11 happens. Now, it's not a comprehensive explanation. I'm not saying I'm the expert on it, but I do have enough confidence to say that what I'm going to talk about is at least some key variables in why 9/11 does happen. But then we're also going to talk about my day as I go through it, because I vividly remember the emotion and the psychology of as each moment was unfolding during that day. And then the aftermath for people like a friend of mine, JC, who survived 9/11 in terms of his life, well, in terms of his existence, but not his life. And people like my roommate, Sarah McGarry, who was never the same. And so there's this question, like, why is 9/11 such this key thing, this one thing? Like, we have others, and of course there are others, that these are what we call watershed events. I'll explain what a watershed event is, why 9/11 is a watershed event. And of course there are other watershed events, absolutely. Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th, 1941, I mean, sorry. So that is a watershed event. Hiroshima, 1945, also a watershed event. These things where we can say things like we do with 9/11. There is the 9/10 world and there is the 9/11 world, where the world is different. And so even though 9/11 happens primarily in New York, but also in the Pentagon in Pennsylvania, in the sense of the actual devastation and destruction and events of that day, it has a blast radius, kind of like Hiroshima, kind of like an atomic weapon, where there's the concentrated effects, and then there's the other effects that kind of go all the way up to Boston, go across the world in many ways. And then there's the historical aftermath of this, and this is kind of like there's a historical blast radius that happens. One of the key things that I want to highlight through all of this is that people who live through these watershed events have a responsibility, a moral responsibility, to be witness to the actual human cost of these events, and to be witness to the living human costs that I bear, and I do, as this goes forward. And there's just no way to get around this. You're going to experience similar watershed events. Maybe not some of you who are as old as I am. Maybe you guys are less keen on cigars, whiskey, and red meat, and you'll live longer. But, but you young people, there's going to be watershed events. Think just about my grandfather. He was born in 1907, and he experienced World War I, the Great Depression, the stock market crash, Black Tuesday, the World War II, Pearl Harbor Day, Kennedy assassination, Vietnam, the Cuban Missile Crisis, so like the Martin Luther King assassination, like so many of these events he experienced just in his lifetime. And one of the reasons I do this is because my second history class, when I was in community college, Moore Park Community College, it's decent, not as good as Saracoso. Well, not as good as Saracoso once I got hired here. But he had this project where he had to go and interview people who lived through these events. And it was eye-opening to me. I interviewed my grandfather, and he was literally talking about these things, including how his brother got out of going to war in World War I, which his parents actually, sorry, this is history, don't be offended, but his parents actually covered him in black paint, put him out into the field, and when the recruiter came by, said, no, our sons aren't here, just our Negro field hands. And they said, well, if they come back, send them our way. And that's how they got away and got out of World War I. And that was very eye-opening to me to get that experience. I talked about my father, who was in 3rd grade when Kennedy was assassinated. And my father, he tells me, and he says, the teacher's crying, and the classmates some of them are kind of upset. He's not really sure what's going on. He goes home, and his parents are very upset, and his brother's crying, and he tells me, he says, I was really struggling to figure out why, because, we're Republicans. So, and I was like, Dad, and he said, what? That's the way 3rd graders think. Maybe that's a little bit too relevant right now, but still, that was kind of, these are eye-opening things. And so I decided to start doing this here in order to be that witness, because out of most people here, I think I'm probably more witness than most. And so, yes, somebody says, Jones gets the spotlight, his ego's going to thrive. Normally, yes, but that'll be next week with the Constitution Day. This day is not about me. One of the few things that isn't about me, right? So, and let's get started with this. So here we have Ground Zero, living through Watershed historical events. And this is the memorial, and these are the footprints of the 2 twin towers. And so this is Ground Zero. I visited it. I visited Ground Zero twice. Once a year after, literally 11 months after September 11, 2001, when it was actually Ground Zero. And I'll talk about that by the end. And then I visited it again 2018, 2019, so when it was now turned into the memorial. So I've seen Ground Zero twice. And it is still Ground Zero. It is Ground Zero. Those are the footprints of the Twin Towers. This is where this watershed historical event took place, and it radiated out even to today. This is what Ground Zero looked like September 12th. This is what Ground Zero looked like 11 months later when I visited it. There was a fence surrounding it. That piece and that piece right there was still sticking out of the fence. And there was a fence around an entire block. And I'll get to that later. But before we do that, there's always this question about like, okay, why is it a watershed event? What is a watershed event? This is the part where I get to teach you, which is one of my favorite things in the world to do. By the way, these are going to be the kind of primary sources. There's actually a lot of sources, and I probably should have put Clash of Civilizations and Francis Fukuyama's article as well, but these are kind of two of the primary sources that I'm using. Lawrence Wright is essentially the definitive journalist who actually interviews people like the brother of al-Zawahiri and others who were part of the Osama bin Laden organization. And so he does all of the interviews, and he is essentially the quintessential kind of authority on Al-Qaeda, build-up of Al-Qaeda leading to 9/11. Destiny Disrupted by Ansari. Ansari is an Afghani Muslim who's educated in the United States. And he has this amazing work where he kind of looks at history through Islamic eyes, because he was born and raised Muslim, but he also was educated and lived in the United States. So he really wants to write this to try and explain to the West how Islam views history and how it's different. And I highly recommend that book. So, moving forward, however, what is a watershed event? Well, this is a watershed, so, I am a Renaissance man, so I do geology too. But, so, the watershed is essentially, it is like frequently a valley or other sort of thing where rain comes in the mountains and other places, and you've got these tributaries that feed into a river, and that creates the watershed, that feeds into a water body. Historians use this analogy similarly, that a watershed event would be like this body of water. And what a watershed event is like a symbol, a marker in time. And this marker in time represents the kind of the expression of historical events that we really didn't see coming. They're gathering. Changes are happening in history, and human beings cannot change as fast as history does. You simply can't. This is part of the drama of life, that history isn't just something that happens. History is something that happens to you. And it happens to you because frequently there's certain people who are at the bottom of this watershed event. And history is gathering for decades, centuries in this case. And as history gathers and gathers, we don't see it coming until one event changes the way we perceive the world. And now all of a sudden we can see a little bit more that we were at the bottom of a flood that was gathering for decades and decades. And so these watershed events are things that change the world, not because they changed the world, because they represent a world that was already changed, but we didn't realize it was changed. This Hiroshima, the world was already changed, but we do know that once that atomic bomb was dropped, once Batman and Little Boy were dropped, that there was no going back. The world had changed. We are now in the atomic age. And that's just hanging over our heads. And that's just the way that it is. And so, but it's not like dropping on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's not like those things caused the atomic age. This was a buildup going back to the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, going back to kind of the age of colonization that was all building and building and building. Matthew Perry opening up Japan. Commodore Matthew Perry, not, friends Matthew Perry. So, and like opening up Japan, and like even Japanese history going back millennia is kind of building up to all of these things coming to this one point of dropping that bomb. And so 9/11 is this watershed event, and there's lots of watershed events. World War II, World War I, the Great Depression. These are all watershed events, but they're big watershed events. They take over years, like they're broad bodies of water. What makes 9/11 so special is it is a watershed event that comes down to the point of a pin. And what I mean by this is that on the morning of September 11th, 327 people woke up preparing for their flights that day. 202,650 people were preparing for work. That included 343 firefighters, 8 paramedics, 71 police officers, and 55 military personnel. None of those people who I just listed would live past 10 a.m. They didn't wake up thinking they were going to be part of a watershed event. They woke up thinking they were going to live life. I didn't wake up thinking I was going to be witness to it. But as it unfolded, it happened. And it happened to this group of people. It happened to almost 3,000 people specifically who didn't know they were sitting right there until it was happening. Since then, by the way, there were 17,400 people on the grounds of the World Trade Center when the first plane hit. Since then, there's been 1,140 cancer cases attributed to 9/11. 1,400 first responders have died by 2014 who responded to 9/11. 10 lost pregnancies by the end of September 11th. 33,000 September 11th related consequences, including PTSD, mental health conditions, other sorts of ailments. This is the blast radius of 9/11, of the people who were right there, including people I know. We'll talk about later. So this is what we mean by a watershed event. What makes 9/11 so special is that it was such a concentrated watershed event, otherwise known as a tragedy. And so let's get to the history part. What's the tributaries? What's the collection of historical waterways that are coming down? Well, the Cold War, it goes way before the Cold War, but we're going to start with the Cold War. So this is a map of the Cold War in 1962. Kennedy is still president for about another year. And in this Cold War, it really represents the dichotomous world. Now, the Cold War is this epic thing in history. For the first time in all of human history, we have a truly global battle. The belief was, as JFK, John F. Kennedy, is going to say in his famous Twilight Struggle speech, it is a twilight struggle. It is a struggle for the twilight of history. There was this growing and growing belief that America and the USSR, the two first nuclear powers, and that technology had advanced so that either the American way of life or the Soviet way of life was going to dominate the globe and essentially for the first time unite the globe, unite all of humanity under one ideology. It was going back to Hegel, right? The idea that history is this buildup of this fight of ideas until one idea finally kind of conquers all of history. Twilight struggle. Matter of fact, Francis Fukuyama, who's going to write the end of history after the Cold War ends in 1990. Well, the Cold War ends in 1991, but he writes, I believe, in 1993 or 4. He's going to argue that democracy won, and so there probably isn't going to be wars anymore. Not in the way we thought, because no democracy has ever gone to war with another democracy in the history of the world. And that the world will change. It's the end of history as we know it, a history driven by warfare, military warfare. It's going to be the beginning of history driven by conflict in many other ways. So this is what we're talking about with this end of history. And because it's the end of history, that means the United States and the Soviet Union were struggling for global dominance. And everybody who had anything of any significance, every country who had significance, I don't mind pointing to Australia when I say that. So any country that had any significance, kangaroos aren't significant, were forced to align with either the United States or the Soviet Union. You couldn't be neutral unless you were insignificant. So if you had things like, oil, you had to choose a side. Because there's no way that the Soviet Union or the United States was going to let the most important resource of the era, oil, fall into the hands of the other side. And so if you had, for example, Africa, if you had minerals for computers, things like boron or uranium for nuclear weapons, atomic energy, then you had to choose a side. And this creates this dichotomous world where we have NATO members, which is direct alliance with the United States. We have Warsaw Pact members, those are red, that's direct alliance with the Soviet Union. And then we have alignment. So the light red are Warsaw or USSR aligned countries, including Egypt, Iraq, and Iran. And we have Western aligned countries. This is going to include obviously Israel, but it's going to include places like Qatar and others in the Middle East. And in this situation, really the rest of the world feels that they are pawns and this game being played out between the chess masters of the United States and the Soviet Union. And as this is happening, the United States has an advantage, and this advantage is key, because this advantage the United States leans on is a key factor that's going to lead to 9/11. The United States has an advantage, what's called soft power. There's hard power and soft power. So, hard power is that military and economic technology power, the ability to say we implement sanctions, or we have a nuclear umbrella, or we have, B-2 bombers, or that sort of thing. Soft power is culture. And the United States had it. We had Hollywood, we had consumerism. We were able to, so in 1959, Richard Nixon, he's going to argue that America's going to win the Cold War through its soft power. This is going to be in the kitchen debates, which are very famously debates that are held in the United States and the Soviet Union, in which they kind of, each side shows the other side its way of life. And each side's trying to present, not to the other side, but to the world, that our way of life is better. That don't you want us to win? Don't you want our ideology to structure the world instead of theirs? And Richard Nixon argues in Moscow to Khrushchev, and he's arguing that he's showing this kitchen of the future. And he's arguing that soft power is how we're going to win. And the truth is, soft power is the primary thing. Hollywood movies are beamed all over the world. The American way of life, including things like I Love Lucy, Leave It to Beaver, including things like the Westerns and others. These are things the Soviet Union doesn't really have. As it turns out, communism doesn't lead to a whole lot of creative innovation. But we also have consumerism. We're exporting our products all over the world. We're exporting our products and our music. And I love a good Russian dirge, right? The Russians, you cannot beat the Russians for like melancholy depression put into like music and story, and there's Dostoevsky. So you can't beat that. But we have a lot more. We have jazz, we have rock and roll, we have, we have country, we have pop, we have, fortunately at the time, not Taylor Swift. So we have all of these things that are exported, and people want to start being like Americans because they see this glamorous lifestyle. People in the Middle East want to be like Americans. In particular, one type of people really want to be like Americans: women. Because what do they see on the American screen? They see a lot more freedom and a lot more kind of independence in America. And they associate that with things like, where's Garrett, so I can kind of emphasize this to him, with things like Levi's jeans. So, Levi's jeans become this thing that it's American, as American as you can be. It was invented by Levi Strauss in San Francisco, and it is both durable, kind of indicating work, but it is also form-fitting. So it is both kind of, when women wear Levi's jeans, it's this kind of huge rebellion against the kind of the Islamic world in a way. Women now signaling with this that they desire to work and they desire to be able to express their sexuality. Well, as you can imagine, the Islamic world is not too fond of this, but they suck it up and deal with it as best they can because of the Cold War. But then the Cold War ends in 1991. And America thinks we've won. But we haven't, because what's percolating throughout all of this Cold War is that resentment. As even our allies are allying with us, they're resenting us at the same time. And this is going to actually start, this is Lawrence Wright, with Saeed Qutb. Saeed Qutb, he is going to essentially be the father, the grandfather, really, of Al-Qaeda. So, in 1948, 3 years after World War II, he goes and tours the United States, and for 2 years. And he really, and he's 40 years old, 42 years old when he starts, and he's a visiting scholar from Egypt. And he's a visiting scholar, and he lands in Colorado. And while he's in Colorado, he writes his first work criticizing the United States. Now, when he went to the United States, he was a fan of the United States. He volunteered to go for the Egyptian government. But by the time, 1 year later, he started the process that is eventually going to lead to fundamentalist Islam calling the United States the Great Satan. He is the father of the Great Satan ideology. And really what he sees here is he's going to write in that book, Americans are numb to faith in religion. They're numb to faith in art. They're numb to faith in spiritual values altogether. Americans are numb to these things because they pursue materialism, female sexuality, and entertainment, and they don't pursue anything of any depth. That essentially, this soft power that America is going to be using is going to be spiritual death. In later works, when he comes back to Egypt, he's going to start writing later works that Islam is essentially will never fulfill its destiny disrupted. Islam will never fulfill its destiny unless it goes back to purity. And that means that it has to resist anti-Westernization. That the key enemy of Islam is Westernization. All Western ideas, values, principles, priorities. And that unless Islam fights a jihad against Westernization, it will never achieve the purity necessary to get back on track, to fulfill its destiny. Now, eventually, he is going to help Abdel Nasser get to become essentially El Presidente of, not El Presidente, they're Egyptian, not Hispanic. So the president of Egypt, and Nasser, 2 years later, is going to imprison him for 10 years and then have him executed for being radical. But during that time, he writes over 30 books making his arguments. After he dies, his brother moves to Saudi Arabia and becomes the preeminent scholar of his work. And he teaches his students all of his work, including Osama bin Laden. Also, al-Zawahiri, another Egyptian, who becomes essentially Muhammad Qutb, Saeed's brother's disciple, and is Osama bin Laden's second, number 2. So, we see that these works come into play. And remember, he was there and he wrote his first work in 1949. That's the beginning of the Cold War. NSC 68 starts the Cold War. So the Soviet Union testing an atomic bomb starts the Cold War. So he's writing at the beginning of the Cold War, he's writing about this Westernization. And the Cold War is going to see the march of soft power to the end. Okay, so the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. Something else happens in 1991. The first Gulf War, Desert Storm. Now, Osama bin Laden actually is a champion of America during this Gulf War. Because Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, he claims to be Muslim, but he's secular. Everybody knows he's secular. And he invades Kuwait. You can tell why, for the oil. He wants the oil. Kuwait's very rich. He wants the oil. He wants to essentially try and have a monopoly on oil. But the problem is everybody knows in the region that once Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, next is going to be Saudi Arabia. But Osama bin Laden cannot handle that because of these two cities, Mecca and Medina. The birthplace of Muhammad, the prophet, and the death, the burial place of Muhammad, the prophet, the two most holy sites. And these have to be protected. So when the Saudi government invites the United States into their territory to defeat Saddam Hussein, he's all for it. But afterwards, when Saddam is defeated, the Saudi government, the House of Saud, does something unforgivable to Saddam Hussein. They invite the Americans to stay to protect them from not only Saddam Hussein in Iraq, but from Iran, because they're the other threat. This is unforgivable because now we have Westerners on holy soil because of Mecca and Medina. And he blames the House of Saud, and they become the enemy. But then he really becomes a student of Saeed Qutb. And by 1993, only 2 years later, he planned the first World Trade Center bombing, which was just a car bomb in the garage. Now, then by 2001, he had a much bigger plan, and that's going to be September 11th. So, but now what's going on with us? Let me leave that there for a second. So living through it, because I did, but living through it, after the Soviet Union fell, it really did feel like the end of history in a way. Like when the car bomb blew up in 1993, we all thought it was, yes, it was an act of terrorism most likely, but it was more like a criminal act, like what the IRA does in Ireland, or what the Basques do in Spain. You're going to treat this as a criminal act. But in terms of, okay, we have to deal with this, but in terms of actually kind of something we have to worry about, no, we won. And it really felt like that. And this is why we got television shows like Seinfeld, which is the first show about nothing. Or Friends, which is what if we put 6 people up there, some of the most self-absorbed, narcissistic son of bitches that we can find, and everybody's like, woo, let's watch that, right? So, and we've got these shows, we've got grunge music, we've got Nirvana who's coming in, like this kind of really self-reflective kind of thing, because we won the war, and now where's the meaning? And we really think that the United States is untouchable to a certain extent. Now, I mean, everybody thinks Samuel Huntington is going to write The Clash of Civilizations, where he says, no, the next battle is going to be a civilizational clash between West and East. And he saw this coming, but everybody dismissed him. And so in 9/10, our security measures are very low. Nobody wants to be thinking that we have to go into another kind of cataclysmic battle. Everybody thinks the United States has won, and it is now the superpower hegemon of the world. This is what 9/11 punctures, is that 9/11 represents the fact that the Cold War is over, and now we are entering a brand new world with a new set of strife. And this is what we experienced on that morning. So now what I'm going to do is share my screen. That's what I'm going to do. This is the 9/11 timeline. You can see this right up there, timeline 9/11 memorial. And I'm going to go through the day of 9/11 and my day. How do what? What?
I don't know. What will happen? Drag it to the screen.
You were saying words. I'm dragging a screen to a screen. I'm a philosopher. I don't do this. I am doing great. Oh.
Then I'll share that on screen 1 to Zoom.
I thought, okay.
It was going to Zoom.
Oh, I gotta stop sharing that. This is why I use a whiteboard. Perfect. Okay. Okay, great. Now I have. Okay, so can't we just duplicate? Yeah, duplicate. All right, we're all good now. Okay, so I was lobbying in Massachusetts. I was a lobbyist with Mass Municipal Association. We lobbied for cities and towns to the state government. I did that for 2 years. It was a wonderful job. I'm going to talk. You work. So yes. Peasants work, nobles talk. So, all right. So we lobbied for cities and towns to the state government. I did that for 2 years. It was a wonderful job. I would have kept doing it. I recommend everybody do lobbying. I literally got paid to play golf sometimes or to drink. So, by the way, You guys might think you can drink. Nobody can outdrink a politician. Those people, their livers are dust. So, but at any rate, so I woke up that morning, and it was going to be a good morning. Because this was the morning, once a month we got to meet with the governor. And the governor of Massachusetts was Jane Swift, and she was 8 months pregnant with twins. And she was the only governor to give birth in office in American history at the time. And she's the first one to give birth in office, the only one to give birth to twins. I don't know how historical that makes her, but it's something. And so we were going to meet with her, and I loved this part of my job. I loved this part of my job because it was real politics. Now my boss, David Bear, I was the junior lobbyist, so he was very clear. My job was to stand there, take notes, and look pretty. So I could do one of those things very, very well, but I'm terrible at notes. So, but it was just, I got to see politics in action. I was a political science major, politics and history double major. This was awesome, and it structured my day wonderfully. The mayors and city councilors who are our members came into town. We set up a political agenda. They talked about how to manipulate the governor and how the governor was going to manipulate them. It was great. So I wake up, I'm excited for the day. I get on the train, I travel an hour and a half into Boston, and so by the time I'm traveling into Boston, because I had to be there at 8:30. By the time I'm traveling into Boston, I get up, and we already have the 19 hijackers who've passed through their screenings in Portland, Maine. And 9/11 had already started, but none of us knew it. 6 a.m., I'm still asleep. But the polling station's open because it's a local election day in New York. 7:59 a.m., I'm pulling in to Boston's North End station. As I am pulling in, because it arrives in 8:03, as I'm pulling in, Flight 11 takes off. Flight 11 has 92 people on board. This flight takes off, and these are these people, and they're supposed to go to California, because Osama bin Laden was an engineer, and he wanted to make sure the plane was loaded with jet fuel. As I'm walking, because I arrive, it takes me about 20 minutes to walk from North End to my office, which is right next to the State House. Flight 175 takes off. Flight 11 is going to be the first to hit. It's going to hit the North Tower. Flight 175 is going to hit the South Tower. Now, also, unbeknownst to me, what also has happened as I'm on the train is my very good friend, JC, who is a currency trader. So he doesn't trade stocks and bonds, he trades currency. So for instance, when like the pound is up and the dollar is down, he trades currency. He makes money off of currency. His trades make millions of dollars a year, and he himself makes about $500,000 a year in commissions from those trades, which in 2001 is a friggin' lot of money. What I didn't know is that he had a meeting in the South Tower of the World Trade Center. I always get this wrong. Some of this is myth now because it's been a while. I know it's the 90-something floor. The plane that hits the South Tower hits in the 77th floor. Everybody above that doesn't get out. So I didn't know that, but that is what's happening. Flight 175 takes off. That's the one that's going to hit the South Tower. 8:19, only 4 minutes after Flight 175 and 20 minutes after the other, I arrive at work. As I'm arriving at work, happy for my day, Betty Ong, the flight attendant, is the first person to signal that 9/11 as a watershed event has begun in earnest. She's the one who reports the hijacking.
The transport's not answering. Somebody stabbed their business class. And I think there's mates that we can't breathe. I don't know. I think we're getting hijacked. Which flight 12? Flight 12.
And what seat are you in? Ma'am, are you there?
Yes.
What seat are you in?
Ma'am, what seat are you in? Well, we just left Boston. We're up in the air.
I know.
We're supposed to go to LA. away, and the cockpit's not answering their phone.
Okay, but what seat are you sitting in? What's the number of your seat?
Okay, I'm in my jump seat right now.
Okay.
And there's more to it, but what you see is that the people she's talking to, they're not taking this overly seriously. They're being very procedural about it, because of course, nobody expects 9/11 to be happening. And a hijacking has almost never happened on American soil. Hijackings are something that happen in Europe, not to us. They don't have, well, why would you hijack a domestic flight? Doesn't make any sense. A minute later, Flight 77 takes off. Flight 175 is going to have 65 people on board. Flight 77 is going to have 64 people on board. Flight 70, including Barbara Olson, the wife of Solicitor General, the lawyer to George W. Bush, the president, Ted Olson. She's taking off. She's on that flight as well as this group of school children, boarding for a conference sponsored by National Geographic Society. And this is the picture they took before they got on that flight. None of these people expected to be the heroes, victims of 9/11. I arrive at work, and I instantly go to the boardroom, to our conference room, and I start piling, with me and my buddy Brian Fong, we start compiling the dossiers that we have, that we give to our meeting members of all the stuff we've done over the last month, and what the lobbyists, the senior lobbyists, not me, again, look pretty, but the senior lobbyists believe that the information that our members need before they meet with the governor. As I'm doing that, Mohammed Atta, he's telling everybody, and this is going to happen to all 4 flights, he's telling everybody, this is just a hijacking, we're going to go back to the airport, we're going to make our demands, and everybody, of course, what would you do? You would sit there, be quiet, be obedient, and all they have is box cutters, pocket knives, these sorts of things. But yet, you're not going to resist because you don't want to be the hero. Does that make sense? You want to be the survivor. And so, people are going back to their seats, and this is making sense. I continue to work with Brian Fong. We talk about how we love this day. The World Trade Center comes to life. That's 17,400 people who are filtering into the World Trade Center. Boston Air Traffic Control alerts the military because of Mohammed Atta's transmission. Flight 93 takes off as I'm working in that conference room. Flight 93 is the one that's going to land, and that's going to where this is going to have 44 people on board and only 4 terrorists instead of 5 because one didn't show up for work that day. So, and these 44 people are going to hear about what's going on. They're going to be the ones who resist, and they caused the flight to land, to plummet into Pennsylvania, a field in Pennsylvania, killing 1 park ranger. Because there was rumors that said this plane was headed for either the White House or Congress, and they believed it was their patriotic duty to do something about that. As I'm working, 846, the North Tower is attacked. Oh yeah, that's good, yeah. So the North Tower is attacked.
It's Tuesday morning, and a plane just crashed into the World Trade Center, and smoke's pouring out the side. Heard this huge boom, very scary, and we turned out, looked out the window, and flames were pouring out of the hole. Extremely scary. We're listening to it on the news. You can hear fire sirens outside, and smoke's pouring out. Very scary.
Can you?
See if we could zoom in. I don't know if you can see much.
She says it's scary. Does she sound overly concerned?
No.
Because if you saw that, even if you saw the plane hit the tower, which most people didn't, what would you think? Terrorist attack? You would now. But you would now because it's a 9/11 world, not a 9/10 world. Most people thought it was an accident. Except for my boss. My boss knew right away somehow. David Baird. The plane hits the tower at 8:46. 8:48, he comes into the conference room and he bursts in and he says, the goddamn terrorist just flew a goddamn plane into the goddamn World Trade Center. He was Irish Catholic, so that's just the way he talked. Goddamn everything all the time. So, but I remember him saying that. And there's a World Trade Center in Boston, but it's only 2 stories tall. So Brian and I were kind of like, what? He says, no, goddamn it. The New York goddamn World Trade Center. He says, go, get the television, hook it up. Something's happening. And he said this, and I remember it because nobody else was believing that it was a terrorist attack, but somehow he knew. I don't know how. But, so Brian and I go get the television, which we only ever used for closed circuit television to watch the Massachusetts State House votes. And so we had to also fish out the antenna, and because we were the junior people, we put the antenna on, and of course it doesn't work, so I'm standing on one side, he's standing on the other, holding the antenna, and we're looking at the TV, and we pop it open, and the news is all over this, and it's showing that scene, and the news is talking about how it's probably an accident or a small plane with a pilot that was suicidal. And they're getting kind of reports, they're dismissing any report that it's terrorism, and they think they're doing their job. Of course they think they're doing their job. Keep calm, don't cause panic. And so we're looking at this. Fire people are mobilized. 8:50, President George W. Bush is in Florida at an elementary school talking to students. He's informed that it was a terrible accident. Not that it was anything else, because nobody knew. 8:55, the South Tower is declared secure. Now, here's the thing that I also didn't know. In 8:46, when that plane hit, my friend JC was on the phone with the administrative assistant of the person he was going to see. And he was on the phone because his train got stopped in Hartford, Connecticut, because it was Amtrak, and Amtrak breaks down 100% of the time. So, and his train got stopped. So he called up, because he had a cell phone, because he was rich. So he called up and he had a cell phone and he was talking to her, and they were rescheduling the meeting because the boss wasn't there either. She was the only one in the office. Now that's going to be important to him later on. And she's rescheduling the meeting, and as they're rescheduling the meeting, he hears the boom, she hears the boom from the North Tower getting hit. And she says, hold on. Something just happened. I don't know if it's an earthquake, something just happened. And then she sets down the phone, according to him. So this is definitely hearsay. But she goes away and she comes back and she says, the North Tower's on fire. I'm not sure if we're getting evacuated. Let me call you back. She never calls him back. But because in part, at 8:55, she's getting ready, most likely, she's getting ready to evacuate, but then 8:55, the South Tower is secure. They declare, and they order people to stay in place, stay in the tower, because they don't want people flooding into the plaza, preventing the North Tower from being evacuated. And so she stays in place, and as she probably calls her boss and starts to prepare, 8:59, the order is given to evacuate both towers, but that's too late, because at 9 o'clock, we're going to get this man, go to hell, Brian Sweeney. We're going to get this man who's going to realize that the plane is low enough, he's getting cell service. And he's starting to see buildings, and so he calls his wife. This becomes one of the artifacts of 9/11.
Jules, this is Ryan. Listen, on an airplane that's been hijacked, and things will go well. I'm looking good. I just want you to know I absolutely love you. I want you to do it. So happy to time. Thanks to my parents and everybody. And I just totally love you. And I want you to be sir. I do. I love you.
After he leaves that message, 3 minutes later, he's obliterated in a fireball along with all the other 64 people on the plane. I'm watching it. I'm literally holding it. I'm watching it as it happens. The newscasters that I'm looking at are still saying, we're getting some information, and as it happens behind them, I literally see this exact shot. This exact shot.
Yeah, hit the other building. Another plane hit the other building.
Another one in another building. Listen, I'm here to get the window. I'm okay.
Another plane.
Another plane. Did you?
Yeah, I heard it.
The other train set. The other building. Listen, I'll call you back later. Okay. I think maybe we should get out of here. Huh?
There's a lot more panic. Instantly, I saw that. Nobody needed to tell me. I knew we were under attack. I can't, it's hard to describe what happens. My stomach hit my throat. The nightmare scenarios are playing out in my mind. And as this is happening, everybody now knows it's a terrorist attack or it's some form of attack. And we have no idea. Instantly, as we're continuing to watch, rumors start to spread. They start talking about how there's up to a dozen planes that have been weaponized that are targeting. Rumors start to happen that these 2 planes came from Boston and that Boston is the center of terrorist activity. So, and I'm just sitting there, I'm in the epicenter of this, and I just don't know. But the only thing I do know is that my life is never going to be the same if I survive this day. And honestly, I wasn't sure I was going to. I'm pretty sure, but not sure enough. And so I'm continuing to watch this, and things keep going, but we're going to pause there for a second. Because then my boss's boss, the actual executive director, comes in, like literally 10 minutes after this happens and says, hey, we've got work to do. Our members are coming in. And my boss goes, God damn it, Jeff. And Jeff says, I know, but they're coming in. They're going to meet at the, we always have a hotel conference room right next to the State House. They're going to meet there. They're not going to know what's going on. We have to carry on as with the normal day because we only have this meeting once. And so he orders Brian and I to grab all the stuff and go and bring it over to the conference room and set up the coffee and everything else. So Brian and I grab the things, the boxes, we have our hand carts, and we walk the essentially block and a half to where we're supposed to go. As we're there, it's a normal day in Boston, downtown Boston. It's a normal day. People are going and getting their Dunkin' Donuts because they're all addicted to it. People are going from one Starbucks across the street to the other Starbucks. It's just, this is kind of what's happening. And I know what's going on, and I'm wondering, do these people know what's going on? What's happening? Many of them didn't. They just arrived. And we get there, we set it up, takes us a little bit to set it up, and as we walk back, everything's changed. Like a half hour later, everything's changed. There's jersey barriers, those concrete barriers. There are now men with M16s and fatigues patrolling around the streets, and there are armored vehicles patrolling the streets. By the time we get back, Brian and I are kind of like, we explain what's going on. We say, I don't know what's going to happen here. But Jeff is adamant. Jeff is also kind of dumb. But as we're doing all of this, on Flight 77, flight attendant Renee May calls her mother and tells her that hijackers have seized control of the plane, forcing passengers and crews to the rear. When they are disconnected, Nancy May calls American Airlines. Minutes later, Flight 77 passenger Barbara K. Olson calls her husband, U.S. Solicitor General Theodore Olson, who's at his desk in the Department of Justice, and she tells him that hijackers have taken over the flight using knives and box cutters. Theodore Olson alerts other federal officials. The president is alerted. You can actually see the footage of him getting up, because now it is an attack. And he doesn't get up and he doesn't go back to Washington. He gets up and he goes to NORAD. He essentially goes to the secure location. The vice president is evacuated. 1947, while we are walking back and we see that militarization, the Pentagon gets attacked. The plane hits the Pentagon with enough force that it actually knocks people out of windows on that side of the Pentagon. When we come back, we're telling them that things have been militarized, and we hear that the Pentagon has been attacked. I don't know what to do. I'm 26 years old at the time. If you do the math if you want. So I'm 26 years old at the time. I have no freaking clue what to do. I'm starting to think that I'm of military age, but I have 2 small kids. I don't know what the hell. Brian is starting to talk, and Brian, who is literally a pacifist, he starts to mutter things to me as we're getting the antenna out. He starts to mutter things like conscious objector. I'll be a conscientious objector. And so, and we get the television, we get the camera out, and I mean by the time we get the television back on, this is what we see.
Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God! No! Oh my God! It's gonna fall down! Oh my God!
And then we're ordered to go back because the mayors are coming in. So we all go back. Most of them don't know what's happening. We're telling them what's happening. And they're supposed to make a decision because we have bylaws that have to be put forward. Jeff is trying to get a hold of the governor. By the time he gets hold of the governor informs him of a few things. One of which they inform him that they're locked down. Boston's going to be locked down. Nobody's getting in and out. Don't even try. And the reason why is because the governor was informed that the FBI believes there's up to 13 other terrorist cells in the Boston area looking for targets of opportunity, including the State House and the surrounding areas. And that they expect at least a half a dozen more terrorist attacks to happen in Boston. And so we adjourn the meeting and we walk back and we hear about the crash of Flight 93, in which one of the passengers, he calls his wife because to tell her they've been hijacked, and his wife tells him what happened in the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And he and 3 other men devise a plan to save it, because she also tells him that his plane is most likely going to target something else in Washington, because it flew from Washington. And he and 3 others devise a plan that they will not let that happen. And so they organize a group of people and they overpower the 2 terrorists, and then they start taking the drink cart and smashing it into the cockpit, trying to open it. And you can hear the two hijackers in there, and they're debating what to do on the black box. And they finally just decide that they're just going to ditch the plane they're going to crash the plane, and they shout, Allahu Akbar the whole way down, and then it just explodes. And right before he hangs up with his wife, this man tells his wife, I love you, and he does not make any bones. He knows he's going to die. He says, I love you, I always love you. I will see you in the next life. Let's roll. And then they attack. The Pentagon collapses, then we get the collapse of the North Tower, and then I'll take it from there.
I
I didn't see I was filming it, but I didn't see it.
I watched that collapse too. They showed it over and over again by the time we got back. And that happened at 10:28. We sat there for another hour, just glued to the television, not sure what to do. We're paralyzed. I'm literally paralyzed. Until finally Jeff Beckwith and David Baer both say, you can do nothing more. Get out of the city before anything else happens. So I walked to the north station, and it is packed. Like thousands and thousands and thousands of people are trying to get out of the city. I'm suffocating. I actually literally almost suffocate in the crowd and mass in the press going towards these trains. I do not get a train until almost 4 o'clock in the afternoon to get out of there. I have no cell phone. I can't call my wife. I have no idea. She can't. I tried to call her at the office, but all the lines are blocked because everybody's calling everybody. So she has no idea. And so by the time I get home, it's like 5:30. And the first thing she asks me is she says, did you see JC at all? Because JC, who's the one I've been talking about, he works in the financial district, and I walked right past it on my way to work downtown Boston. And frequently we'd arrive at the train together and we'd walk together. And his wife is desperate because she knew he had an appointment. And she's just hoping that the appointment got canceled. And I hear what's going on, and I have no idea. I say, no, I didn't. We also have a roommate, Sarah McGarry, and she was a paramedic for Boston. And she says, also Sarah's not home yet because she usually works the shift from 12 to 12 in midnight to 12 in the afternoon. And she said, Sarah's not home yet. I said, probably with all that's going on, when she comes back, we'll find out. We'll learn from her what's going on. She doesn't come back for a week. And so we find out from Sarah that as soon as that first tower fell, the call went out to every surrounding area that paramedics, fire, and police, that they can just pick up and go as long as they have their own transportation, and they can go and help out with what's going on. She instantly got in her car, drove, and she was at the ground zero by 5 o'clock that day. And she explains what happens. And she says they had so much help, actually, that the thing that they really had her do was she was handing out water to all of the people helping. And she says at first, 9:12, 9:13, 9:14, 9:15, it was actually very positive. They were finding survivors. People were reunited. They were celebrating. But then after that, they weren't finding survivors anymore. They were finding body parts. And she got stationed right next to the tent where they were collecting body parts to put them together in order so that loved ones could have something to bury. And she said she just couldn't do it anymore. She started to get very depressed, and so she came back home. And she tells us what's going on. And within a week, she has to go on antidepressants. And for the rest of the time I knew her, she was on antidepressants. She was diagnosed with PTSD. She survived, but there were consequences. The next day we find out JC, his train broke down. By the time I talked to him, when JC's recounting his story to us at a group gathering, it starts to become clear that he has massive survivor's guilt. He starts saying things like, she died. I didn't. Because I was rich and she wasn't. Because her boss was rich and she wasn't. She was the peasant. And that's why she died. And he has this massive survivor's guilt. And it actually, come to find out later, triggers something he was had medicated at. I didn't know about which was bipolar. He was bipolar, and it triggered his mania. By the end of the year, before I went to visit Ground Zero 11 months later, he had over a dozen affairs. His family moved to Texas to get away from him. He told his wife that he thinks he never loved her. And I went to a movie the week before with him, the week before we left, because I was moving up to California to go to USC, to get a PhD, to be here saying this to you. And I drive him back to the apartment he's living in now, because they sold the house. And I say, JC, what's going on? And he just says, I did not survive 9/11. I exist now. I don't live. And if I couldn't be the thing that drags my family down, and I knew that I couldn't stop having the affairs, because it's the affairs and danger and all these things are the only thing that make me feel like I'm not in this deep depression right now. And so it's better for them to move to Texas than to be around me. The blast radius of ground zero continues. So we're going to start wrapping it up here. But 11 months later, I get accepted into the PhD program. We're moving out to California, and I have never visited New York, and I need to go. So we go and visit New York. My wife's uncle, Tim, they live literally a block from Times Square because his partner was a producer for The View and the assistant to Barbara Walters. And so we go there, and that day I say, I have to visit. I have to go see it. And Tim says, it's depressing. And I say, I have to go see it. So we go down. He finds a parking spot the way only a New Yorker can. Like, he essentially parks a Mercedes in a smart car spot. And it's a block away, and we start walking, and as we start to see it, we see that rubble that we talked about, we see those sorts of things. My wife says, I'm out. She goes back to the car. I go with Tim, and I need to do this pilgrimage. It's all fenced off, and so I start walking around as if I'm going to walk around, and that's going to be some therapeutic thing, some spiritual release for me. But instead, what I see is one side, the fencing is littered. Littered is not the right word. Plastered with notes, memorials, pictures, candles, flowers, and just people with kind of saying, I miss you, people saying, have you seen? Because even 11 months later, there's people missing in action. And people even writing letters to other people who they know are alive. And so I start reading them, feeling like I must be a witness to this, to these people who are bearing the brunt of this Watershed event. And I start reading the letters, and it's just, and then I come to this one letter, and it ends it for me. The letter starts out, I don't remember the names, so we're just going to call them John and Maria. So I don't remember the names, the actual names of them, but I pretty much know how the letter goes in general. So the letter starts out with, hi John, I hope you're doing well. A group of us are meeting this upcoming Friday. We're going to meet, and we're going to talk about it. We're going to process all that's happened. I just want to let you know that this person didn't go to work that day. This person made it out. This person evacuated before the tower collapsed. And she's starting to talk about all these people that they knew. And then she starts saying, this person didn't. This person we still haven't found. This person. And then she says, so, we're going to go and we're going to meet. And I'm thinking, I'm kind of naive in this, I'm thinking that she's trying to post this to let him know to meet them on Friday. And it totally makes sense to me in a way that he might have just had his own PTSD, disconnected from them, and they might know that he's walking around and they're trying to get some message to him to come and do this therapeutic exercise. And so she says, so that's why we're meeting on Friday, so we can drink to all those who didn't make it out, and we can take joy in all of those who did make it out. I take hope that all of those people made it out. I just really wish you did too. And she says, I'm so sorry, John. I'm so sorry. I had to give the ring back to your mother. It would have been a beautiful wedding. You would have been a wonderful husband. But now all you can be is a beautiful memory. And that ended me. And this is the reason why I do this right here. Because John and Maria, whoever their actual names were two of those people who on September 11th, she was engaged, he had given her a ring, and they were planning a wedding. By 10 o'clock, she was almost a widow. They never expected that. And so, what I'll wrap it up with is this. History is something that happens to us. We will survive it or we won't. Some of us will survive it, but will only exist afterwards. But here's the thing. Like, this can happen to any one of us. And part of me thinks that John and Maria are some of the bravest people in that whole situation. Because what they did is they lived anyways. They went and got married knowing that at any point history could come and destroy everything they built, but they did it anyways. Brian Sweeney, he and his wife loved each other, even though he had to leave her that message that she has preserved ever since. That's the bravery of life, is you live anyways, knowing that you will suffer loss. And those of us who witness your loss in these tragic events, we're the ones who are supposed to talk about the human cost and to encourage everybody else to, son of a bitch, live anyways. Because life can happen at any time, so you might as well be brave and take the adventure of life now. Because it's better to be John and Maria who were planning a wedding and lost it than to be somebody who was so afraid they couldn't even have anything to lose. That's September 11th. That's the history and the personal cost of September 11th. I do this every year because I have to. I'll see you later.